Welcome back. You are watching Global Eye. Tens of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets of Israel protesting against some judicial reforms passed by the government. The legislation passed would protect Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from being deemed unfit to rule because of his corruption trial. It stipulates that a Prime Minister can only be deemed unfit to rule because of health or mental reasons. Remember, Netanyahu is facing charges of fraud, breach of trust and accepting bribes in a series of scandals. Amid these protests, Netanyahu visited UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. The UK identified Israel as a vital international partner, and Sunak has stressed the importance of upholding democratic values that underpin the UK-Israel relationship. Let me now go across to Amir Tibon, senior editor at Haaretz, a leading Israeli newspaper. Amir, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Eye. Let me begin by asking you, why are these judicial reforms or this judicial overhaul so contentious, and how will this really impact the way Israel is governed?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. These changes to the balance of power between the authorities in Israel are quite dramatic, and it's not a coincidence that now for 11 straight weeks, basically almost 3 months, hundreds of thousands of people go out every weekend to protest all over Israel, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to smaller cities around the country. In Israel, the way the system is built, there is no clear separation between the government and the legislator, because the government enjoys a parliamentary majority that gives it the ability to rule. And the only real check on the government's power is the Supreme Court of Israel. And what the government wants to do through a series of very controversial pieces of legislation is basically to significantly weaken the Supreme Court and give some of its powers to the government itself. One of the most contentious issues is the process of appointing judges. They want the government to have the ability to appoint the Supreme Court justices without any need for consultation with the sitting judges or with the opposition. And you mentioned Netanyahu's corruption trial, so here's an interesting situation. Today in Israel, justices to the Supreme Court are appointed by a committee that includes sitting judges, politicians, and the lawyers' bar. If the government took over the ability to appoint all the judges by itself, when Netanyahu's case will reach the Israeli Supreme Court a year or two from today, because no matter what will happen in the district court where it's being heard right now, there will be an appeal, Netanyahu will basically have the power to select his own justices, to select the people who will judge on his corruption case. That is obviously a very problematic situation. And so what the protesters are demanding here in Israel is to basically state that these legislations will be put on hold and there will be negotiations between the government and the judicial branch and the opposition to reach a more moderate and balanced form of judicial reform.
Right. Amir, what is the kind of support these legislations have in the Israeli parliament and also within the Israeli government coalition?
In the government coalition, this is basically something that enjoys the support of almost all the members. And right now, Netanyahu is governing in a coalition that includes his own Likud party and all of Israel's religious parties. It's the most religious and nationalistic coalition in Israeli history. And the interesting question here is not why do the religious parties support this change? Because they've actually been advocating for decades to weaken the Supreme Court. They view the Supreme Court as a liberalizing force in Israeli society that is responsible for a lot of the progress on minority rights and women's rights. But Netanyahu himself, over the years, blocked any attempt to weaken the Supreme Court from these coalition partners that he's been governing with, and he took pride in it. There are interviews where he says, I am proud to defend the Supreme Court, and an independent judiciary is a cornerstone of democracy. And this was in line with the historical character of his party, the Likud party, which used to be considered the national liberal party of Israel, hawkish on foreign policy issues, but liberal on domestic issues. Suddenly, now, the same Netanyahu is supporting these changes. And you have to ask if this is connected somehow to his trial. In terms of public opinion, we can only rely on polls, and we do see constantly in public opinion polls that the majority of Israelis and a significant minority of Netanyahu's coalition voters want this legislation to be put on hold. And they want the government, instead of pushing it through in a manner that does not include any consultations with the opposition and the judicial system, to start a more slow and deliberate and cautious process of negotiations. Right now, that doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
All right, Amir Tibon, thank you so much for joining us here on Global Eye, giving us your view on the protests that are escalating across Israel right now and why this is so contentious. Thanks once again for being with us here on Global Eye. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of the program. News continues on CNBC-TV18. Stay tuned.